The bronze bell tolled across the Shang capital of Yin, its deep reverberations cutting through the morning mist like a blade through silk. In the shadow of the great oracle bone temple, a young woman named Lian pressed her forehead against the cool earth, her fingers digging into soil stained dark with centuries of ritual sacrifice. Around her, thousands knelt in the same position. Farmers with calloused hands, craftsmen with bent backs, slaves with hollow eyes. They had been there since before dawn, waiting for their god-king to emerge and speak the will of heaven. But Lian was not praying. She was counting. 17 families had disappeared from the western quarter in the past month. 43 names scratched into oracle bones, offered to the ancestors in exchange for rain that never came. 128 days since her brother had been taken to the palace foundries, promised 3 meals, and returned to her as ash in a ceramic jar. The priests had told her it was an honor, that his spirit now served the divine King Di Xin in the realm beyond death, that heaven had chosen him. Lian had stopped believing in heaven the day she buried that jar. The crowd stirred as the temple doors groaned open. Lian raised her head just enough to see the procession emerge, priests in robes of crimson and gold, carrying staffs topped with bronze faces of ancient spirits. Behind them came the royal guard, their armor polished to mirror brightness, their faces as expressionless as the metal they wore. And then, finally, Di Xin himself. The king of Shang was not what travelers' tales suggested. He was not a monster with fangs and claws, not a demon draped in human skin. He was simply a man, middle-aged, with a beard trimmed to aristocratic precision, his robes embroidered with dragons that seemed to writhe in the morning light. But it was his eyes that made Lian's blood run cold. They held the absolute certainty of someone who had never been told no, never been denied, never been questioned. They were the eyes of a man who believed himself a god. "Children of heaven," Di Xin's voice carried across the plaza without effort, trained from birth to command. "The spirits speak to me in dreams. They show me visions of prosperity, of conquest, of an empire that will span from the eastern sea to the western mountains. But the ancestors demand tribute. They hunger for devotion. They require proof of our faith." Lian felt the woman beside her begin to tremble. Her name was May, mother of 3, wife of a potter who had spoken too loudly at the market about the grain shortages. They had come for him 2 days ago. "The bronze for our weapons, the copper for our bells, the tin for our vessels, these gifts must be cast in the sacred fires. The foundries require skilled hands. The ancestors require worthy souls. Those who labor in the divine workshops walk closest to heaven itself." It was a beautiful lie, wrapped in silk and ceremony. Lian had seen the foundries from a distance, great pyres that burned night and day, fed by prisoners, debtors, and anyone who dared question the king's divine mandate. The bronze vessels crafted there were indeed magnificent, intricate works that depicted gods and heroes in stunning detail. But Lian knew the cost of each curve and character. She knew because she had washed her brother's clothes when he returned from his first week of labor, finding his hands blistered and bleeding, his lungs rattling with each breath from the toxic fumes. She knew because the clothes she washed before he died had been more blood than fabric. "Lord Chancellor Bi Gan will collect the names of volunteers," Di Xin announced. A ripple of fear passed through the crowd like wind through wheat. No one volunteered for the foundries. You were volunteered. Serve heaven, and heaven will remember your bloodline forever. As the king retreated into his temple, the crowd began to disperse in anxious silence. Lian stood slowly, her legs numb from kneeling, and helped May to her feet. The older woman's face was wet with silent tears. "They will take my children next," May whispered. "I have no husband to protect them, no family with influence. They will take them, and they will call it service." Lian opened her mouth to offer comfort, but the words died in her throat. What could she say? That the gods were merciful, that justice existed, that heaven watched over the righteous. She had believed those things once when she was younger and foolish, before she understood that heaven only watched over kings. "Come," Lian said instead, taking May's arm. "Let us find food. The market may still have—" "You there! The tall one with the scarred cheek!" Lian's heart became ice. She turned slowly to find a palace guard standing 3 paces away, his hand resting on the pommel of his bronze sword. The scar he mentioned was a mark from childhood, a fall from a tree that her mother had tended with honey and prayers. Now it had made her memorable. Now it had marked her for notice. "The Lord Chancellor wishes to speak with you," the guard said. It was not a request. Lian felt May's hand tighten on her arm, felt the older woman's terror transmit through that touch like fever through flesh. "I have done nothing wrong," Lian said, keeping her voice steady. "I am a weaver. I pay my taxes. I attend every ceremony." "The Lord Chancellor wishes to speak with you," the guard repeated, his expression unchanging. "You may come willingly, or you may be carried. Choose." There was no choice. There had never been a choice. That was the fundamental truth of life under the Shang. The gods had ordained kings, and kings had ordained everything else. To resist was to resist heaven itself, and heaven, so the priests insisted, could not be resisted. Lian released May's arm and stepped forward. She did not say goodbye. She did not promise to return. In that moment, she felt herself becoming one more name in a long list of forgettable tragedies. A young woman who had existed for 23 years, whose life had been unremarkable except for its ending. She would be processed, her name recorded on an oracle bone, and her fate decided by priests reading cracks in heated shell and believing they saw the will of gods. The guard led her through winding streets that grew progressively wider and cleaner as they approached the palace district. Merchant stalls gave way to aristocratic compounds, their walls painted with scenes of ancient victories and divine favor. She passed a mural depicting King Tong, founder of the Shang Dynasty, receiving his mandate from a dragon whose scales were real gold leaf pressed into plaster. The dragon's eyes seemed to follow her, judging, condemning. She entered the palace through a side gate used for servants and prisoners. The distinction between the two had grown increasingly blurred over the past decade of Dixin's reign. Inside, the air was cooler, scented with incense that couldn't quite mask the underlying smell of molten metal and human sweat. The foundries were close. Lord Chancellor Bigan waited in a small reception chamber decorated with bronze vessels that probably represented hundreds of lives. He was a thin man with the scholarly stoop of someone who had spent decades bent over oracle bones and bureaucratic tablets. Unlike the king, his eyes held no divine certainty, only the weary calculation of a man managing an empire built on lies. "Lin, of the Western Quarter," he said, consulting a wooden tablet. "Sister to Fang, deceased. Daughter of a farmer, also deceased. Trained as a weaver. 23 years of age. No living family. No debts, no criminal record." He looked up. "No one to miss you." The words hung in the air like a noose. "That is inaccurate, my lord," Lian heard herself say. "I have friends. I have—" "You have no one," Bigan interrupted. But his tone was not cruel. If anything, he sounded tired. "That is not an insult, child. It is a fact I must record. Do you understand why you are here?" Lian's mind raced through possibilities. Had someone reported her for the way she held her head too high during prayers, for failing to weep sufficiently at her brother's memorial, for the thoughts that surely showed on her face when Dixin spoke of heaven's will? "I do not, my lord." Bigan set down his tablet and studied her with eyes that had lost their color to age and disappointment. 3 days ago, a merchant caravan arrived from the west. They carried rumors, along with their jade and silk. Rumors of a kingdom called Zhou, growing powerful beyond the mountains. Rumors of a leader who speaks not of heaven's mandate, but of heaven's will, being tested by the conduct of kings. He paused. Rumors of rebellion. Lin's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face still. Rebellion. The word itself was dangerous, carrying the weight of severed bloodlines and executed generations. "I know nothing of such rumors, my lord." "I believe you," Bigan said, surprising her. But belief is not the issue. Perception is the issue. You were seen speaking with a traveler from the West 4 days ago, in the market. A brief conversation, but witnessed. Memory surfaced, an old man asking directions to the potter's quarter, his accent marking him as foreign. She had directed the way, nothing more. I directed a stranger to the craftsman's district. That is all. That is enough, Bigan said. In another time it would be nothing, but these are not normal times. The king dreams of threats everywhere. His advisors whisper that dissent spreads like disease, that any contact with Western travelers might spread dangerous ideas. He picked up his tablet again. I am to send you to the foundries. Your name has been entered in the records. By law, you are already committed. The world seemed to contract around Lin. The foundries? The same flames that had consumed her brother? The same toxic air that had rotted his lungs? The same bronze vessels that would be displayed in temples while her bones turned to ash? Please, she whispered, and hated herself for begging. I have done nothing. I am loyal. I believe in... Stop. Bigan raised his hand. Do not debase yourself with lies. I can see in your eyes what you believe. I have seen that look in 10,000 faces over 30 years of service. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. I am going to tell you something that could have me executed if repeated. The foundries need workers, yes, but what they truly need is silence. The king has ordered the creation of weapons, thousands of weapons, enough to equip an army to march west and destroy this Zhou kingdom before it grows strong enough to challenge us. Then the rumors are true, Lian asked. There is resistance? There is always resistance, Bigan said, but most resistance dies before it grows roots. Most would-be rebels are caught, executed, and forgotten. This, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. This is different. The Zhou have a leader named Ji Fa. He speaks not of conquest, but of justice. Not of divine mandate, but of heaven's will being tested by the conduct of kings. He paused, and his words spread like fire in dry grass, because people want to believe there is an alternative to this. He gestured vaguely at the palace around them, encompassing everything it represented. Lin struggled to process what she was hearing. A Lord Chancellor of the Shang Dynasty speaking against his own king? It made no sense, unless... You want me to carry a message, she said slowly, to the West, to these rebels. Her face still as an immovable mask, her eyes a place where hope died. Why, Lian demanded, why would you betray your own kingdom? Because it is already dead, Bigan said quietly. I have read the oracle bones. I have studied the cycles of dynasty and collapse. When a king believes himself a god, when he feeds his people to fires and calls it devotion, when the very priests begin to doubt their own prophecies, that kingdom is finished. The only question is how many die before it falls. He stood and walked to a small window overlooking the foundry district. My nephew died in those fires last month. He was 9 years old and committed no crime except being born to a family Dishin considered potentially disloyal. I held his body. I told his mother it was heaven's will. He turned back to Lin. I will not do that again. Even if I wanted to help, Lin said carefully, I would not know where to find these rebels. I am a weaver, not a spy. You will not need to find them, Bigan replied. They will find you. There are people in the western mountains who watch the roads.
They help refugees escape the foundries. If you can reach them, if you can tell them what is being prepared here, they can warn Jifa. Perhaps he can prepare. Perhaps more people survive what comes next. Perhaps, Lian echoed. You are asking me to risk my life on perhaps. I am asking you a choice, Bigan corrected. Die in the foundries over the next few months, your death serving a god-king's vanity, or risk death trying to escape, your attempt serving something larger than yourself. He returned to his desk and wrote rapidly on a tablet. This document transfers you to the Northern Grain Assessment Office, a bureaucratic appointment that no one will notice or question. It will buy you 3 days before anyone realizes you are not where you should be. After that, you are on your own. He pressed his seal into the soft wax, the bronze stamp leaving the mark of his authority. Then he did something unprecedented. He bowed to her, not the shallow, aristocratic nod of acknowledgement, but a full bow of respect given to equals. I do not know if you will succeed. I do not even know if you will try. But I choose to believe that sometimes history turns on the courage of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Go or stay. Live or die. The choice, for once, is yours. Lian took the tablet with hands that trembled despite her efforts to steady them. The wax was still warm under her fingers. If I am caught, you will be tortured for information and executed publicly. Your name will be cursed in temples. Songs will be written warning children about the traitor girl who defied heaven. That is what will happen if you are caught. And if you are discovered helping me, the same, with the addition that my entire family will be eliminated to the 3rd generation. My wife, my daughters, my grandchildren. The price of treason is not paid by the individual. Then why? Because someone must be first. Every revolution begins with someone deciding the cost of continuing is greater than the cost of resistance. I am too old and too visible to fight, but I can open doors. I can create chances. What you do with this chance is your decision. Lian stood in that chamber for a long moment, feeling the weight of the tablet in her hands and the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Outside, she could hear the foundries roaring, consuming lives and turning them into bronze and ash. She thought of her brother, of May's children, of the 10,000 faces Bigan had seen over 30 years, all wearing the same expression of suppressed rage and helpless despair. The Northern Grain Office? Where is it? Beyond the outer walls, near the western gate, Bigan allowed himself a small smile. Very near the western gate, a very convenient location for assessing grain shipments from the frontier provinces. I see. Do you? Bigan asked. Because once you walk through that door, there is no returning. Not to this life, not to safety. Every step west is a step deeper into a future you cannot predict. I thought about safety, about the life I had been living, head down, voice silent, and each day identical to the last except for the slow accumulation of losses. That was not safety. That was just a slower kind of death.
I am already dead, she said. According to your records, I have been assigned to the foundries. My name is on an oracle bone somewhere. The girl I was died the moment that guard called my name. She met Bigan's eyes. But perhaps someone else can be born. Someone who walks west instead of into flames. Bigan nodded slowly. Then go, quickly.
The guard who brought you is loyal to me, but there are others in this palace who are not. Take nothing from your home. Speak to no one. The grain office has supplies and a horse. Use them." Lian bowed, mirroring the respect Bigan had shown her. Then she turned and walked from the chamber, through corridors that smelled of incense and empire, past bronze vessels that had cost more lives than she could count, toward a gate that opened not to safety, but to possibility. Behind her, Lord Chancellor Bigan returned to his window and watched the foundries burn. He had served the Shang Dynasty for 30 years. He would serve it until his death, which he suspected would come soon. But perhaps, if the gods were kinder than the kings who claimed to speak for them, his final service would matter. Perhaps one weaver girl could carry a message far enough to change everything. Perhaps. The horse was old and sway-backed, more suited to pulling carts than bearing riders, but Lian accepted it with silent gratitude. The grain office official, a woman whose eyes held the same exhausted calculation as Bigan's, had asked no questions, simply handed over supplies and pointed west. "The road forks at the Stone Crow marker," the woman had said. "Most take the southern route because it's patrolled and safe. You will take the northern route because you're stupid and poorly trained for this assignment." The emphasis on the last words made their true meaning clear. "Understand?" "I understand I am very stupid," Lian had replied. "Good. Then survive your stupidity or don't. Either way, I saw nothing." That had been 2 days ago. Now, Lian rode through landscape that seemed determined to erase all evidence of human ambition. The great monuments of the Shang capital had given way to smaller towns, then villages, then nothing but farmland interrupted by occasional ruins of earlier dynasties. She passed a field where jade burial masks poked through the soil like strange flowers, evidence of aristocrats who had believed their wealth could purchase immortality. Now they grew turnips. The northern road was indeed less traveled. Lian encountered no patrols, no merchants, no one at all until the second evening when she found the burned village. It was small, perhaps 20 families, judging by the foundations. The fire had been recent enough that the smell of charred wood still hung in the air. Lian dismounted and walked through the ruins, trying to understand what had happened. There were no bodies, which was strange. Bandit raids usually left evidence. This looked deliberate, methodical. Buildings destroyed in order of importance. The headman's house first, then the grain storage, then everything else in systematic sequence. "Military," a voice said behind her. Lian spun, hand going instinctively to the small knife at her belt. A figure emerged from the ruins of what had been a well. A man perhaps 30 years old, his clothes marking him as a traveling monk, though his eyes were too sharp for religious contemplation. "Easy," he raised empty hands. "If I meant harm, you would be bleeding already. I am unarmed and uninterested in violence." He glanced around the burned village. "Unlike the soldiers who did this." "Why would the army burn its own villages?" Lian asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Because someone in this village spoke to a traveler from the west, or traded with someone who had, or simply looked at a patrol captain wrong. The why hardly matters. What matters is the message." He kicked at a charred beam. "This is what happens when heaven grows insecure." Lian studied him carefully. "You speak dangerous words for a holy man." "I am not a holy man. I am simply a man who walked too far in the wrong direction and found himself unable to return." He sat on a fallen wall, uninvited and unconcerned. "My name is Shen. I am from this region originally, though I left many years ago. I return periodically to see what has changed, The answer is always for the worse. I am Lian. I know. The casual assertion made Lian's blood run cold. How could you possibly? Because there are only 3 people who should be on this road right now. 2 of them are me. The third is a weaver from the capital carrying a message from Lord Chancellor Began to anyone in the West who would listen. I assumed you were either that weaver or someone hunting her. Your reaction to this village suggested you were shocked by government cruelty rather than causing it, so I concluded you were the former. You are one of the Watchers, the ones Began mentioned. Watcher implies more organization than actually exists. I prefer the term extremely concerned citizen who happens to know which roads connect to which destinations. Less dramatic, more accurate. He stood. Your horse is exhausted, you have no experience with wilderness survival, and you are approximately 3 hours ahead of the patrol that is searching for you. Did Began warn you that the transfer documentation would only fool administrators, not the secret police? He did not. Typical. Brilliant man, terrible at operational details. He walked to Lian's horse and examined it with practiced hands. This animal will die if you push it further tonight. We need to hide, rest, and move before dawn. I know a place. I do not trust you, Lian said. Sensible. I am a stranger with unexplained knowledge who appeared in a burned village and immediately knew your name. You would be an idiot to trust me. He began walking toward the tree line beyond the village. You will follow me anyway, because you have no alternative, and because, despite your suspicions, your instincts are telling you I am not your enemy. Those instincts are correct, incidentally. But you will make your own decision. He disappeared into the forest without looking back. Lian stood among the ruins for a full minute, weighing options that all felt like variations of doom. Stay and face the patrol. Ride on and watch her horse die beneath her, or follow a strange man into unknown darkness, trusting nothing but intuition. Her brother's voice echoed in her memory, from years ago when they were children and she had hesitated at the top of a tall tree. Sometimes, he had said, the only way forward is to jump and build wings on the way down. Lian led her horse into the forest. She found Shen 100 paces in, waiting beside a stream that babbled invisibly in the darkness. He nodded as if her arrival had never been a question, and began moving upstream with the confidence of someone who had walked this path many times. Lian followed, her exhaustion growing with each step, but her curiosity growing faster. They climbed for perhaps an hour, the terrain growing rockier, the trees thinning. Finally, Shen stopped beside what appeared to be a solid cliff face. He reached into a crevice Lian would never have noticed and pulled out a clay lamp already prepared with oil and tinder. A few strikes of flint and warm light pushed back the darkness to reveal a cave entrance cunningly hidden by the angle of approach. "Welcome to my office," Shen said. Small, uncomfortable, but strategically invisible to passing patrols.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Inside, the cave opened into a space large enough for several people to sleep. Someone had stored supplies here: dried meat, grain, water vessels, even blankets that smelled of cedar oil. Shen set about making a small fire, using wood that produced almost no smoke, while Lian tended to her horse and tried to process the situation she had stumbled into. "How many refugees have you guided through here?" she asked. 17 in the past year, Shen said. "Mostly families fleeing the foundries or the grain taxes. A few like you, carrying messages or intelligence. You were the first sent by someone as highly placed as Began, which suggests things in the capital are worse than I thought." "Sin is preparing for war," Lian said.
A massive assault on the Zhao, thousands of weapons being cast, the entire economy being bent toward military production. Shen's hands paused in their work. How soon? Bikan believes within 2 months, before the winter makes campaigning impossible. 2 months, Shen repeated. That is problematic. The Zhao are strong, but not prepared for that scale of assault. If Di Xin can mobilize his full strength before they fortify— He left the thought unfinished, but Lian understood. Massacre. Complete destruction of the only organized resistance to Shang tyranny. Can we reach them in time to warn them? We. I appreciate the assumption of partnership. Shen finished with the fire and sat cross-legged, studying Lian across the flames. The Zhao capital is 15 days hard travel from here. With your horse, 20 days. The patrols are increasing. The border is more heavily guarded than it has been in decades. So no, arriving in time is not guaranteed. Surviving the attempt is not guaranteed. Success is not guaranteed. He smiled without humor. But then, nothing worthwhile ever is. Lian found herself smiling back despite the situation. There was something liberating about Shen's brutal honesty, his complete absence of the careful euphemisms that defined court speech. How did you end up doing this? Hiding in caves, guiding refugees, risking your life for strangers? Shen was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. He finally said, I was a soldier once. Not a grand general or heroic warrior, just a regular soldier in a regular garrison following regular orders. One day, those orders included pacifying a village that had failed to meet its grain quota. We were told they were hoarding, that they had plenty, but were hiding it from inspectors. So we went to confiscate the hidden stores. He paused, and Lian saw old pain surface in his eyes. There were no hidden stores. They had given everything they had and were slowly starving. Children with bellies swollen from malnutrition, elders too weak to stand. But we had orders, so we searched anyway. And when we found nothing, our captain decided they must have hidden the grain very cleverly indeed. He ordered us to tear apart every building until we found it. You refused? Lian guessed. I wish I could claim that nobility. No, I followed orders. I destroyed homes. I terrified children. I did everything a good soldier is supposed to do. And at the end, when we still found nothing, because there was nothing to find, our captain reported a successful mission. He wrote in his log that we had discovered the grain, distributed appropriate punishment for the hoarding, and restored order. Shen looked at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. 2 weeks later, I learned that village had been wiped out by starvation. Every person. They had nothing left after we tore their homes apart. And I realized I had not been serving heaven. I had not been maintaining order. I had been enacting murder under bureaucratic cover. So you deserted. So I became useless to the army. Sudden incompetence, failure to follow orders, repeated mistakes in front of witnesses, until they discharged me as unfit for service. Then I walked away and started looking for ways to undo what I had done. I cannot restore those lives, but I can preserve others. It is not redemption. It is just less guilt. I understood that reasoning in my bones, Lian said quietly. I could not save my brother, but perhaps I can save someone else's brother. Is that naive? Probably, Shen agreed. But naivety is just hope that has not yet been disappointed. And hope, however foolish, is what keeps people moving when reason says stop. He handed her a water skin. Rest. We leave before dawn. Tomorrow will be harder than today, and every day after will be harder still. The patrols are thickest at the border, and Desin's secret police are not known for mercy. How do you know so much about their movements? Because some of them are less loyal than they appear. Not many, but enough. Even tyrants cannot rule without the consent of those who carry out their orders. And when those orders become monstrous enough, some people begin to misplace information, leave doors unlocked, fail to notice refugees on the roads. It is not open resistance. It is simply the erosion of absolute obedience, cracks in the foundation. Is that enough to bring down an empire? History suggests it is. Empires do not fall to armies. They fall when the people who build and maintain them stop believing the empire deserves to exist. The military defeat comes later, after the spiritual collapse is complete. Desin still commands tens of thousands of soldiers, but how many of them actually believe he speaks for heaven? How many would die to preserve his rule versus how many simply have not seen an alternative? He lay down, pulling a blanket over himself. Lian lay down as well, her body aching from 2 days of riding. Above, through the cave entrance, she could see stars. The same stars that looked down on the capital, on burned villages, on the Zhou kingdom beyond the mountains. The same stars that had watched every dynasty rise and fall across thousands of years. She wondered if they cared which side won, or if anyone did, or if history was just an accumulation of people making desperate choices and hoping they mattered. Sleep took her before she found an answer. Part 3. The Price of Truth. The patrol found them on the 8th day. They had been making good progress, moving mostly at night, sleeping in hidden camps Shen seemed to know by instinct. Twice they had bypassed military checkpoints by taking paths that barely qualified as trails. Once they had waited, barely breathing, when soldiers passed within arm's reach, so close Lian could hear them complaining about their officers and the terrible food. But on the 8th day, their luck dry ran. It happened at a river crossing. The water was shallow but fast, the rocks slippery with moss. Lian was leading her horse across when she heard Shen's sharp whistle, a bird call that would sound natural to anyone who did not know it meant danger. She looked up to see soldiers emerging from the tree line, 6 of them, armed and alert. The captain stepped forward, a man with the squared jaw and confident bearing of someone who never doubted his place in the world's hierarchy. "Travelers," he called out, his voice carrying easily over the rushing water. "These roads are restricted by order of the God King. State your purpose." Shen raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "We are pilgrims, honored captain, traveling to the western temples to make offerings for our ancestors." "Pilgrims," the captain repeated, his tone making clear what he thought of that explanation. "With no guard, no official documentation, and moving during restricted hours, unusual devotion." "We are poor," Shen said. "We can't afford the permit fees. We hoped—"
The patrol found them on the 8th day. They had been making good progress, moving mostly at night, sleeping in hidden camps Shen seemed to know by instinct. Twice they had bypassed military checkpoints by taking paths that barely qualified as trails. Once they had waited, barely breathing, while soldiers passed within arm's reach, so close Lian could hear them complaining about their officers and the terrible food. But on the 8th day, their luck ran dry. It happened at a river crossing. The water was shallow but fast, the rocks slippery with moss. Lian was leading her horse across when she heard Shen's sharp whistle, a bird call that would sound natural to anyone who did not know it meant danger. She looked up to see soldiers emerging from the tree line, 6 of them, armed and alert. The captain stepped forward, a man with the squared jaw and confident bearing of someone who had never doubted his place in the world's hierarchy. "Travelers," he called out, his voice carrying easily over the rushing water, "these roads are restricted by order of the God King. State your purpose." Shen raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "We are pilgrims, honored captain, traveling to the western temples to make offerings for our ancestors." "Pilgrims," the captain repeated, his tone making clear what he thought of that explanation. "With no guard, no official documentation, and moving during restricted hours? Unusual devotion." "We are poor," Shen said. "We cannot afford the permit fees. We hoped—" "You hope to evade the law," the captain interrupted. He signaled his men to spread out, cutting off retreat. "I admire the honesty, but it does not improve your situation. You will come with us for questioning." Lian felt time slow, felt the weight of the knife at her belt and the absolute certainty that drawing it would be suicide. 6 trained soldiers versus 2 exhausted travelers. The mathematics of violence were not favorable. But then she noticed something. The captain's men were spreading out, yes, but their formation was sloppy. 2 were positioned too close together. One was watching Shen while another watched Lian, creating a split focus. And the captain himself had stepped forward alone, confident in his authority, separated from his support. They were disciplined, but not experienced. Probably garrison soldiers, used to intimidating farmers, not fighting actual opponents. Shen noticed too. She saw him calculate the same odds, reach the same dangerous conclusion. His hand drifted toward his belt, where he had hidden a small bronze knife that he had insisted she never ask about. "Captain," Lian called out, her voice trembling just enough to sound genuine, "please, we truly mean no harm. We are simply—" She let herself stumble on the slippery rocks, crying out as she fell into the shallow water. The performance was clumsy but effective. The nearest soldier instinctively moved to help her, his attention diverted for just a moment. That moment was enough. Shen moved like water flowing downhill, inevitable and fast. He covered the distance to the separated soldier before the man could raise his spear, struck him in the throat with an open palm that produced a sickening crack, and was already turning toward the next target before the first had fallen. The second soldier managed to get his weapon up, but Shen ducked under the thrust and kicked the man's legs out from under him, following him down with an elbow strike that ended the fight. 2 down in heartbeats. But the remaining 4 were recovering, spreading out properly now, their shock transforming into trained reaction. The captain drew his sword, proper bronze, beautifully crafted, probably worth more than Lian's entire life, and advanced with the careful footwork of someone who had studied under real masters. "Kill them both," he ordered. Lian rolled in the water, came up with a rock the size of her fist, and threw it at the nearest soldier with all her strength. It caught him in the temple. He went down hard and stayed down. 3 left. Shen had acquired the spear from the soldier he had kicked down and was using it to keep the other 2 men at distance, but he was giving ground steadily, backing toward the water. The captain was circling, looking for an opening. Lian grabbed another rock and threw it. Missed, grabbed another. This one caught a soldier in the shoulder, not enough to disable him, but enough to make him flinch, giving Shen the opening to thrust forward. The spear point took the soldier in the thigh. He screamed and collapsed. 2 left. The captain's eyes met Lian's across the water, and she saw her death in them. He knew she was not just a pilgrim now, knew she was a threat that needed elimination. He moved toward her with deliberate speed, sword raised. Lian had no weapons left except her small knife. She drew it knowing how pathetic it looked against his bronze blade, knowing this was probably the end of her brief revolution.
But before the captain could close the distance, Shen was there, his acquired spear blurring through the air in strikes that forced the captain backward. Bronze rang against wood as the captain deflected each thrust, his superior weapon giving him advantage, but his position giving him none. He could not advance without impaling himself. He could not retreat without losing authority. The stalemate broke when the last unwounded soldier tried to flank Sen. She saw him coming and did the only thing she could think of. She threw herself at his legs in a desperate tackle. They went down together in the shallow water, both gasping and struggling. He was stronger, but she had surprise and desperation. Her knife found his arm, drawing blood. He punched her in the face and stars exploded across her vision. Then his weight was gone. Lian blinked through pain and water to see Shen standing over her, breathing hard, the dead soldier floating face down in the current. The captain was gone. He ran, Shen said, answering her unspoken question. He saw his man dead or dying and made the tactical decision to retreat and report. We have perhaps an hour before reinforcements arrive. He helped Lian to her feet. Can you ride? Lian touched her face gingerly. Her cheek was swelling. Her head rang like a struck bell, but nothing felt broken. I can ride. Then we ride, now. No rest, no stealth, just speed and hope the gods that abandoned Dishin still favor desperate refugees. They fled. For 3 days they moved in a haze of exhaustion and fear. Lian's horse died on the 2nd day. Collapsing mid-stride from exhaustion, even terror could not override. They continued on foot, stealing food from fields, drinking from streams, sleeping in 2-hour bursts while the other kept watch. Twice more they encountered patrols, but both times they managed to hide rather than fight. Once they buried themselves in a grain cart and endured an hour of interrogation while soldiers stood 3 feet away. Lian had pressed her face into moldy wheat and prayed to ancestors she no longer believed in, begging for just one more miracle, just one more unlikely chance. The ancestors, surprisingly, seemed to listen. On the evening of the 3rd day, they saw the mountains. They rose from the western horizon like the spine of a sleeping dragon, purple in the fading light, impossibly tall. Somewhere beyond those peaks was the Chu kingdom. Somewhere beyond was the army that could end the Shang Dynasty. Somewhere beyond was a future that might be different. The border garrison is at the base of the pass, Shen said. He looked as exhausted as Lian felt, his clothes torn, his face gaunt. It is the most fortified position between here and the capital. We cannot fight through it. We cannot sneak past it. But we do not need to. What do you mean? There is another pass, Shen said. Higher, dangerous, normally impassable this late in the season, but it leads to the same destination and it is unguarded because no sane person would attempt it. I assume we are about to attempt it. Assumption correct. Shen pointed to a barely visible line of shadow on the mountain face. That path was used by smugglers before Dishin cracked down on border trade. It is steep, narrow, and exposed. If we slip, we die. If the weather turns bad, we die. If we simply run out of strength before reaching the top, we die. Versus the definitely death of trying to pass the garrison. That's exactly. So, we climb. They began at midnight when the moon was bright enough to light their way but dim enough to make them hard to spot from below. The path was everything Shen had warned about and worse. Sometimes it was barely wide enough for one person to pass sideways, with 1,000-foot drops on one side and sheer cliff on the other. Sometimes it disappeared entirely, forcing them to climb hand over hand on rocks that crumbled under their weight.
Lian had never been athletic. She was a weaver who had spent most of her life sitting at a loom. Her hands were strong from years of work, but her legs shook with every step. Her lungs burned with thin mountain air, and her mind screamed that this was impossible, that she should just stop and let gravity take her, because it would be faster and less painful than this endless suffering. But she kept moving because Shen kept moving, and because behind them was everything she had fled, and ahead was everything she hoped to find. Dawn found them halfway up the mountain, exhausted beyond thought, clinging to rock and breathing in shallow gasps. The world below looked like a painted scroll, the land they had crossed laid out in miniature, the burned villages and hidden camps and desperate river crossings all reduced to abstraction by height and distance. "Do you see it?" Shen asked, pointing back the way they had come. Lian squinted into the morning glare. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then movement caught her eye, a line of darkness flowing across the landscape like spilled ink. Soldiers, hundreds of them, moving west in organized columns. "The vanguard," Shen said. "Sin is not waiting 2 months. He is moving now." Lian felt ice flow through her veins, despite the climbing sun. If the invasion had already begun, then their message was already too late. They had crossed half the kingdom, survived patrols and violence and the death of her horse, all to deliver intelligence that was now obsolete. "We have to move faster," she said. "We have to survive," Shen corrected. "Dead messengers deliver nothing. We climb at the speed the mountain allows, or we fall and achieve nothing. Come, the summit is close." Close was relative. It took them another 6 hours to reach the top of the pass. 6 hours of agony, during which Lian's world contracted to the next handhold, the next footstep, the next breath. Her hands were bleeding from sharp rock. Her legs had long since passed through pain into numbness. Her mind had entered a state beyond exhaustion, a kind of meditative trance where thought became impossible and only motion remained. But she reached the summit. She stood at the top of the world, or what felt like it, and looked down into the valley beyond. It was green and gold, touched by late afternoon sun, dotted with villages that looked prosperous and whole. No burned buildings, no foundries belching smoke, just land that had been allowed to remain land, people who had been allowed to remain people. "The Zhou Valley," Shen said beside her. "Welcome to the kingdom that believes heaven can be questioned." Lian wanted to feel triumph, wanted to feel relief or joy or anything positive, but all she felt was exhaustion and the pressing weight of knowledge. An army was marching, war was coming, and she had no idea if her warning would arrive in time to matter. "How far to their capital?" she asked. 2 days, but we do not need to reach the capital." He pointed to a cluster of structures visible in the valley below, too organized to be a village, too military to be a town. "That is a forward garrison. They will have fast riders. If we can reach them by tomorrow, they can carry our message to Jifa faster than we ever could." "Then we keep moving." "Then we keep moving," Shen agreed. They descended. General Zhang had seen many strange things in his 40 years of military service, but 2 half-dead refugees staggering into his camp claiming to carry intelligence about a Shang invasion ranked high on the list of improbable events. "They could be spies," his lieutenant suggested, "sent to feed us false information while the real attack comes from a different direction." "They could be," Zhang agreed, studying the pair through the flap of his command tent. The man looked like a former soldier. The way he held himself despite exhaustion gave it away. The woman looked like she should be dead. Her face was bruised, her hands wrapped in bloody cloth, her eyes holding the hollowed-out expression of someone who had seen too much too quickly. But those eyes also held something else: determination, a core of steel that mere physical damage could not bend. "Or," Zhang continued, "they could be exactly what they claim. Refugees from the capital carrying information worth their lives. Bring them in, carefully." The interrogation took 2 hours. Zhang listened as Lin spoke, her voice hoarse but clear, detailing everything: the foundries, Bigon's revelation, the army columns moving west. Shen corroborated details and added military analysis, his training evident in how he described troop compositions and strategic positions. When they finished, Zhang was quiet for a long time. "If you are lying," he finally said, "you have chosen a remarkably elaborate deception that provides information we could verify independently within days, making the lie pointless." "We are not lying," Lin said flatly. I believe you, Zhang replied, which presents a significant problem. Our army is dispersed across 3 provinces. King Jifa is in the capital, 2 days' ride from here. Mobilizing for a defensive campaign will take weeks that we apparently do not have. He stood and began pacing, a habit formed from countless war councils. The Shang have numerical advantage, better equipment, more experience. If they can bring their full force to bear before we consolidate our position, they will crush us like grain under a stone. Then what do we do? Lin asked. Zhang stopped pacing and looked at her. An interesting question. Note that you said we rather than you. You believe yourself part of this now. I crossed a kingdom to deliver this message. I am not stopping now, Lin said. Fair enough. Zhang returned to his seat. What we do is simple in concept, difficult in execution. We do not wait for them to attack us. We attack them first on ground of our choosing before they can consolidate their forces. He gestured to the map spread across his desk. The terrain between here and the border is mostly open plains, terrible for defense, excellent for the kind of massed assault the Shang favor. But there is one location where the geography shifts, the plains of Muye. Ancient battlefield, historically significant, and tactically interesting because it has a river on one side and hills on the other. If we can force them to fight there, we can offset their numerical advantage. How? Shan asked. You just said we cannot mobilize fast enough. We mobilize what we have, Zhang said. Every soldier within 3 days' march, every militia group, every trained man who can hold a weapon. It will not be our full strength, but it will be enough to make Di Xin pause. And if we position ourselves correctly, if we move fast enough, we can make him think we are stronger than we are. Bluff, Shen said. Strategy, Jan corrected, based on understanding our enemy. Di Xin believes heaven favors him. He believes his divine mandate makes him invincible. But that belief also makes him cautious. He cannot afford to lose, because a loss would shatter the myth of divine support. So he moves carefully, overthinks, second guesses. If we can create the impression of strength, make him doubt his intelligence, force him to reconsider his approach, we buy time. And with time, we can gather the rest of our forces. Lin tried to process what she was hearing. This general, speaking calmly about manipulating a god-king's psychology, discussing tactics as if they were deciding where to plant crops rather than where thousands would die. When do we move? She asked. We? Zhang raised an eyebrow. You have delivered your message. Your part in this is done. Rest, recover. Let soldiers handle the soldier work. No. The word hung in the air. Zhang's lieutenant looked scandalized. Shan looked resigned, as if he had expected this. No, Zhang repeated. I came to deliver a message, yes. But I also came because I was tired of kneeling, tired of watching people die while priests explained it was heaven's will, tired of being told my place was to weave and pray and accept whatever the powerful decided. She stood, ignoring the protests of her exhausted body. I am not a soldier. I cannot fight, but I can stand with those who do. I can bear witness. I can be one more person saying that heaven does not belong to kings. Zhang studied her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. You sound like Jifa. He also has opinions about where heaven belongs. Very well. You may accompany the army as an observer. But if fighting starts, you find cover. Martyrdom may be spiritually satisfying, but it accomplishes nothing tactical. Understood. Over the next 2 days, Lin watched an army assemble from scattered pieces. Soldiers arrived from garrison posts. Farmers came with militia weapons. Even a few merchants showed up with carts full of supplies they had somehow known would be needed. It was not the massive, organized force the Shang could field, but it was fierce and determined, built not from obligation, but from choice. And it marched under a different kind of banner. The Shang flags depicted dragons and divine symbols, their inscriptions proclaiming heavenly authority. The Zhou flags were simpler, wheat stalks and mountains,
symbols of the land and the people who worked it. No gods, no divine mandates, just a statement that this kingdom belonged to those who lived in it. On the third day, they reached the plains of Muye. It was a haunting landscape. Ancient stone markers dotted the fields, remnants of earlier battles between dynasties now forgotten. The earth here had drunk so much blood over so many centuries that local folklore claimed crops grew taller and redder than anywhere else. Looking at the open ground, Lin could believe it. "They will arrive tomorrow," Zhang announced to his assembled officers. "Our scouts report they are moving slower than expected. Supply train problems probably. It gives us time to prepare positions. We hold the hills on the northern side, which gives us high ground and makes us appear more numerous than we are. We keep cavalry in reserve to respond to their maneuvers, and we send riders to the king begging him to march here with everything he can gather." "And if he cannot arrive in time?" an officer asked. "Then we hold as long as possible and hope our sacrifice buys enough time for the rest of the kingdom to prepare," Zhang said matter-of-factly. "Ideally, we will not need to test that scenario, but armies do not win battles by assuming ideal conditions." That night, Lin walked among the soldiers. They sat around small fires, talking quietly, checking weapons, writing letters they hoped would never need to be delivered. Some were barely older than her. Some were old enough to be her grandfather. All of them had chosen to be here, knowing they might die on this ancient killing ground. She found Shen sitting alone staring at the distant horizon where the Shang army was camped, their fires visible like a constellation fallen to earth. "Regrets?" she asked, sitting beside him. "Many, but not about this. This is necessary, even clean. I know who my enemies are. I know what I'm fighting for. It is simpler than the moral confusion of garrison duty." He looked at her. "You should not be here. Tomorrow will be terrible." "I know." "No, you do not. You have seen violence, but you have not seen battle. It is not like stories make it sound. There is no glory, just noise and blood and people screaming from mothers who cannot help them. You will see things you cannot unsee. Then I will carry those things, the same way I carry everything else. People need to know what it costs when kings claim divine authority. They need to know that it's not abstract, that it's blood and screaming and children calling for mothers. If I survive, I will tell them. That is my purpose now." Shen was quiet for a moment. Then, "You have become dangerous. Not in the way soldiers are dangerous, but in the way ideas are dangerous. People will follow ideas further than they will follow swords." "Is that bad?" "History cannot decide. Some ideas lead to liberation, some lead to worse tyranny. But either way, you cannot stop being dangerous now. You have seen too much, chosen too clearly. The girl who wove cloth in the capital is dead. What you are becoming is something else." "What am I becoming?" she asked. "Someone history will remember, or someone history will forget. But either way, someone who chose to act rather than endure. That is rarer than you might think." Dawn came too quickly.
The Shang army, caught between two forces and bloodied by sustained combat, began to break. First a few soldiers fleeing, then entire units, then complete collapse as panic spread faster than any general's orders. They had come to Muye confident in divine favor and found only mud and death, and the realization that heaven was not on their side. And in the center of the collapsing army, visible even from a distance, was Dixin. The god-king of the Shang sat on his chariot, surrounded by his personal guard, watching his invincible army disintegrate. For perhaps the first time in his life, he was seeing clear proof that his divine mandate was a lie, that heaven did not choose kings, that power came not from gods, but from people choosing whether to grant it. Lian found herself running down the hillside without conscious decision, pushing through the chaos of battle, desperate to witness this moment. Dishin, who had ordered her brother into the foundries. Dishin, who had burned villages and called it divine will. Dishin, who had claimed to speak for heaven itself. She needed to see his face when heaven rejected him. She got close enough to see his expression, and what she saw was not rage or defiance, but something worse: confusion. He genuinely did not understand how this had happened. In his mind, the divine mandate was real. His authority was absolute. This defeat was not just military, it was theological. His entire reality was collapsing. His guards formed around him, preparing for a last stand. But before the Zhou soldiers could close in, one of his own generals rode forward and said something Lian could not hear. Whatever it was made Dishin's confusion transform into betrayal. The general dismounted, walked to Dishin, and pulled him from the chariot. And then the general knelt, not to Dishin, but toward King Jifa, who was riding into the center of the battlefield, flanked by his commanders. "The God King of the Shang," the general said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "I deliver him to heaven's judgment, which speaks not through kings, but through the will of those they rule." It was a defection. Not just soldiers switching sides, but a high-ranking officer publicly renouncing his loyalty and offering his king as prisoner. The symbolism was complete. The mandate of heaven had transferred not through divine proclamation, but through human choice. Dishin fell to his knees in the mud of Muye, surrounded by the corpses of soldiers who had believed he was chosen by gods. He did not speak, did not plead. He simply knelt there, a man who had believed himself divine, discovering he was merely human. Jifa dismounted and walked toward him. The Zhou king was nothing like Dishin. No elaborate robes, no bronze crown, no symbols of divine authority. He wore simple armor, dirtied by travel and battle. He looked like a man, not a god. And somehow that made him more impressive, not less. "I claim no mandate from heaven," Jifa said. His words meant not just for Dishin, but for everyone in earshot. "I claim only this, that kings who feed their people to fires, who call cruelty divine will, who demand obedience and give nothing but death in return, such kings have forfeited their right to rule. Heaven may or may not exist, but if it does, I believe it speaks through human virtue, not royal bloodline. And today, virtue has spoken." He turned to address the assembled soldiers, both Zhou and the surrendered Shang. "The God King of the Shang is gone. The Shang Dynasty is ended. But we do not seek revenge. We seek something harder. A new order where authority comes from service, where kings are held accountable, where people are not fuel for divine ambition, but the purpose of governance itself." It was a beautiful speech. Lian wanted to believe it completely, but she was aware enough to know that pretty words after victory were easy. The test would come in how those words translated to reality. Whether Jifa would become the virtuous ruler he claimed to be, or just another king with better rhetoric. But that was a question for future days. For now, on this ancient battlefield, something had genuinely changed. A king who claimed divine authority had fallen to an army that claimed human dignity. It might not be the revolution Lian had dreamed of in her darkest moments, but it was a start. She found Shen among the celebration, sitting on a stone marker and cleaning his blade. He looked as exhausted as she felt. "We survived," he said. "We did. Many did not. I know." She had seen the bodies, would see them in nightmares for however long she lived. But it mattered, didn't it? What we did, the message we carried, it actually changed things. "It did," Shen agreed. "Change is not always the same as improvement. History will decide if today was liberation or just the replacement of one dynasty with another." "You are surprisingly cynical for someone who just won." I am surprisingly realistic for someone who has lived long enough to see the patterns. But yes, today was victory. Today was meaningful. And on days like this, I choose to believe in possibility rather than inevitability. Tomorrow, I can return to cynicism. Lian smiled despite everything. What will you do now? The war is over. You could go home, rest, let someone else carry the weight. Could, said Shen, but I suspect I will do what I always do. Watch the roads, help people escape the worst of what comes next. Because even good kings create situations that need escape. Even virtuous governments produce refugees. There is always work for those willing to do it. Then I suppose I will help you. You do not owe me anything. You delivered your message. You witnessed history. You survived. That is enough. Perhaps, but I have learned something important. I prefer choosing my path over having it chosen for me. And I choose to keep walking beside someone who understands that empires fall when people stop believing in them. That seems like useful knowledge going forward. Shen studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled, a rare, genuine expression. Then welcome to the aftermath. Lian the Weaver, may you find it more forgiving than the war.
3 years later, Lian stood in the capital of the Zhou Kingdom and watched construction crews dismantling what had been a Shang oracle bone temple. They worked carefully, preserving the bones themselves for museums, but destroying the architecture of divine authority. Where priests had once interpreted cracks as commands from gods, there would soon be a public forum where people could debate governance. It was not perfect. The Zhou Kingdom was not the utopia Ji Fa had described in his speeches. There were still nobles with too much power, still corruption in the bureaucracy, still people who fell through gaps in the new order. But there were no foundries consuming lives for bronze vessels, no villages burned for insufficient devotion, no one claimed to speak directly for heaven. It was improvement. That would have to be enough. The delegation from the western provinces is waiting, a clerk informed her. Lian had become something between diplomat and historian, someone who could speak to people from all levels of society because she had lived among them, someone who understood what it meant to survive tyranny and could explain to those who had not experienced it why certain changes mattered. She found the delegation in the council chambers, farmers and craftsmen, people with calloused hands and practical concerns. They wanted to know if the new government would protect them from bandits, if taxes would be fair, if their children would have futures beyond subsistence. Lian spent 3 hours explaining what she knew, acknowledging what she did not, and helping them understand that their voices now mattered in ways they never had before. It was exhausting, unglamorous work, nothing like the dramatic moment of Muye, but it was important. When she finally left the chambers, she found Shen waiting outside. He had aged, they both had, but his eyes still held the same sharp awareness. Another productive afternoon of explaining how democracy works to people who have never experienced it? He asked. Another afternoon of explaining that we do not have democracy yet, but we have something closer to it than before, Lian corrected. How was your trip to the border? Illuminating. The Shang remnants are organizing. They want their dynasty back. They believe Xin was divinely chosen and his defeat was temporary divine testing. They are, in short, still living in the past. Will they be a problem? Eventually, but not immediately. Most people who lived under Shang rule have no desire to return to it. The myth of divine kings is dead, killed at Muye. What remains is nostalgia and bitterness, which is dangerous but not insurmountable. They walked together through the capital streets, past markets where people traded freely, past schools where children learned to read texts that questioned rather than simply praise authority. It was not perfection, but it was different, and different, after centuries of cruel sameness, was revolutionary. "Do you think we were right?" Lian asked suddenly. "To tear down the old order? To reject the idea of divine kings? What if we just have replaced one tyranny with another that takes longer to reveal itself?" Shen was quiet for a moment. "I think we were necessary," he finally said, "not right or wrong in some absolute sense, but necessary for that specific moment. The Dixin Shang Dynasty had become a machine that consumed people and produced nothing but suffering disguised as divine will. It needed to end. Whether what we built to replace it will be better in the long term, that depends on what people do next." "No pressure," Lian muttered. "All the pressure, but distributed across millions of people making millions of small choices about what kind of world they want to live in. That is the actual revolution. Not the battle, not the king's defeat, but the daily decision to build something better than what was." They reached Lian's small house. Nothing grand, just a place to sleep and think, and occasionally weave, because she found the old rhythm soothing. Shen would continue to his own quarters, then leave at dawn for another border patrol, another refugee camp, another crisis that needed someone who understood how systems failed and people survived. "Will you see me again soon?" "Eventually. The world is large, but the network of people trying to improve it is small. We will cross paths again." "Good. I would hate to face the future without at least one person who remembers we are all just making this up as we go." "The fundamental truth of governance," Shen agreed. "May you never forget it." He walked away into the evening crowds, and Lian watched him go. Then she entered her house, lit her lamps, and sat at her loom. Not to weave cloth for trade, she had enough status now that she did not need the income, but to weave, because the repetitive motion helped her think, helped her process the strange life she had fallen into. 3 years ago, she was a girl kneeling in a plaza counting the disappeared and hoping only to survive. Now she was someone who spoke to farmers about governance, who had witnessed the fall of a dynasty, who had helped carry the message that changed everything. She was still learning what that meant, still learning how to live with the memories of Muye, with the faces of the dead, with the knowledge that her choices had contributed to both liberation and violence. She was still learning how to hope without being naive, how to work for improvement without expecting perfection. It was hard, complicated work, the kind that never finished, that simply continued day after day after day. But it was hers, chosen freely, pursued willingly. And on difficult days when she questioned whether anything mattered, whether one person could make a difference in the vast machinery of history, she reminded herself of a fundamental truth. Every revolution begins with someone deciding they deserve better. Every empire falls when enough people make that decision simultaneously. And every new world is built by those who survive the fall and choose to keep building anyway. She was one builder among thousands, one voice among millions, one small life in the vast sweep of history. But she had chosen. And that choice, multiplied across countless others making similar decisions, had toppled a god-king and shattered the myth of heaven's mandate. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was everything. Outside, the sun set over the capital of a new dynasty. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new crises, new questions without easy answers. But tonight, in a small house where a weaver worked her loom, there was a kind of peace. The peace of knowing that when heaven had fallen silent at Muye, people had spoken instead, and their words had been enough. Duho Haglabal.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.